right, it looks like we have a good amount of people here, so we'll go ahead and get started. I know that we all have a lot of things to do. So welcome everyone to our Cultural Connections March program, which is all around decolonizing museums. My name is Carly and I am part of the Cultural Connections Board. We are a community of Bay Area museum, arts, and culture professionals who meet regularly to exchange ideas, share resources, and inspire creativity. And we offer programs and networking events. And we're really excited to continue offering these events in a virtual sphere so that we can move beyond our Bay Area. We are also about to begin board recruitment. So if you are interested in learning more, you can always check out our website or contact one of us directly. Our next program is in May and is going to be about community-centered fundraising. So if that's a topic that you're interested in, stay tuned for email updates and continue to check our website and follow us on social media. And while I know that since this is a virtual event and we are logging in from all over, I do want to mention that Cultural Connections is based in the Bay Area, and we acknowledge that those of us in the Bay Area are on the ancestral lands of the Ohlone people and are on unceded territory therein. So if anyone else would like to offer any other land acknowledgement in the comments, you are welcome to, and that's definitely something that we will be talking more about in just a few minutes. Lastly, I want to give a big thank you to our presenters this evening, as well as our Cultural Connections board members who have helped develop this program, Paige, Greta, and Allie. And I will now turn it over to Paige, who will be our moderator this evening. So thank you all very much, and I hope you all enjoy.
Thank you, Carly, and thank you everyone for joining our discussion tonight. I want to give a huge thank you to our 3 program participants. We have Brandie MacDonald joining us from the San Diego Museum of Us, Sharaya Souza from the American Indian Cultural District in San Francisco, and Joe Horscapture from the Autry Museum of the American West in Los Angeles. So it's exciting for us to be able to bring together this great community of people. It looks like there's some people joining us from all over. I saw one from Georgia, quite a few from us across the state of California, maybe some other out of town folks as well. So thanks for this. For tonight's program, we want to hear mostly from our 3 speakers. So what we're going to do is I'm going to be asking our speakers some questions and we'll have a discussion for the next 45 minutes or so, but then we want to give some time at the end to open it up to audience Q&A. So for the meantime, we'll request that the audience keep on mute just so there's no background noise, but please, if you have any questions as the panelists speak, feel free to drop those directly into the chat, and otherwise feel free to ask some questions at the end. We'll circle back to that to make sure that we can hear from our audience as well. So thank you, welcome speakers, welcome our audience, and thank you for supporting Cultural Connections. So to start out, let's do a round of introductions. So I'd love to hear from our 3 panelists a little bit about you, about your work, and a short intro. So Brandie, why don't we start with you?
I was hoping you wouldn't call my name first.
The first on my Zoom screen, so no particular order.
Halito chokma, so nofa Brandie MacDonald, chikasasea, chatasea. My name's Brandie MacDonald, pronoun she, her. I am a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation with ancestral ties to the Choctaw Nation, also Scottish, a little bit of Scottish as well. Let's see, about me. So I work at the Museum of Us, which sits on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Kumeyaay Nation. It's also, I think, really important to note that we are all on Indigenous lands, everyone at every part of globally, wherever you are within your little Zoom rectangle, you're on Indigenous land. So acknowledging that, I think, is really important in this space, in this digital space. I'm the director of decolonizing initiatives at the museum, and I don't want to take up too much space, so I'm going to pause there and pass it. I'm just so grateful to be sitting on this panel and sitting in community with Sharaya and Joe. I think they're amazing, and I'm excited to have this conversation with y'all.
Thanks so much, Brandie, and we're so happy to have you here. Sharaya, I'll turn it over to you.
Uh-oh. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. My name is Sharaya Titaltos Pueblo Ute and Kiowa. I'm the executive director for the American Indian Cultural District in San Francisco. And yeah, I will go ahead and pass it over to Joe.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for the hosts to invite me to this on a wonderful Wednesday evening. My name is Joe Horsecapture. My community is from Fort Belknap Indian Reservation, North Central Montana. My tribal affiliation is A'anine. I am Vice President of Native Collections. I got a crazy title. Vice President of Native Collections and Curator of Native History and Culture at the Autry Museum of the West. I'm a second generation curator. My father, George Horsecapture, was one of the first curators in the country. And I've been working in the museum field probably about for 30 years. It's good to be here. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So to kick off this evening, it would be great to hear from the three of you a little bit more about your work in the sphere of decolonization and also your thoughts on the word decolonization. So Joe, I'm going to turn it back to you to start that discussion.
All right. Well, I knew this question was coming and I've been thinking about it for a couple of days since you sent it. So I'm trying to figure out how to sort of massage my answer. In the past, maybe 5, 6, maximum 8 years, communities have certainly had a new relationship with museums. They're revisiting how museums are presenting different cultures. The phrase that people often use now is decolonization. I am not a supporter of that term. I am a supporter of the idea behind that term, but I'm not a supporter of that term. Instead, as I look at it, based on my experience, I prefer the term reclamation, because particularly, and again, I'm just talking about my experience working with Native history and culture and objects and art and all that kind of stuff. The term decolonization to me, well, first of all, if museums are the pinnacle of colonization, right? You cannot take colonization out of a museum. You cannot decolonize, right? Like if you defrost your refrigerator, you're taking all the frost out of your refrigerator. You can't take all the colonization out of the museum. So to me, that term is inaccurate. Instead, and plus decolonization, again, from my point of view, puts Native people in a sense of responding to what has happened. It's putting us in a sense of response. Where for me, reclamation, Native people are more active. We're reclaiming our stories, reclaiming our space, reclaiming our objects, our ancestors, our photographs, our intellectual property, everything. For me, I prefer reclamation. And of course, this idea of what I term reclamation is not a new idea. Probably one of the earliest times we could think about it is 1969 with the occupation of Alcatraz. If you look at some of the proclamation that they did, that they wanted, one of the last things they want is, hey, we want a Native American museum because other museums aren't telling our stories right. In 1972, the Walker Art Museum, believe it or not, had a phenomenal, probably the best Native American show that I know of, called American Indian Art Form and Tradition. Everything museums doing now for Native people, American Indian Art Form and Tradition in 1972 already did it. So I come to the perspective, there's very little that we can do in the museum field that is new dealing with Native related things. And of course, lastly, and not to make a plug here by any means, but you know, my father, 1979, was one of the first curators in the country at the Plains Indian Museum. Part of his initiative was to have a board of all Native people who advised him as the museum went forward. So this whole idea is not a new thing. In fact, it's quite old. For myself, what I'm interested in is ensuring that we bring Native voice and Native perspectives in all the work that we do. I can sort of boil it down to that.
Thanks so much, Joe. And Brandie or Sharaya, do either of you want to follow up?
Sure. I guess mine will be a little bit different too, because I know Brandie, one of her titles is like Decolonizing Museums. So, and I love that you all are bringing up this topic. Just a little bit about me prior to my role here with the Cultural District is I came from Native American Heritage Commission. So my engagement with museums was typically when they were holding on to Native American human remains or basketry, things they weren't supposed to be holding on to. You know, like Joe said, when I think about museums, I think about the epitome of what started colonization, the folks that were going and raiding, you know, American Indian cultural sites and putting, you know, our ceremonial beads, our burial goods, you know, our burial cultural items on display, you know, against American Indian people's will. And so, you know, my thoughts when I hear the word museum is like, I don't have positive connotations with it. However, I have seen, you know, beautiful spaces in Chicago and other places. I know the California Indian Museum, you know, works with tribes regularly in Sacramento in order to rewrite that history. But for us, you know, I like one of our elders said that, you know, we're not the display, we're the story. And so with the American Indian Cultural District, we don't call it decolonization either. We call it indigenize. So everything we do, we're working on this project called Indigenize San Francisco. And so we're taking those stories of, you know, the Old American Indian Center, which burnt down in 1969 before the occupation of Alcatraz, which kind of sparked that takeover of Alcatraz. And we're telling that story. We're doing oral history and interviewing our elders, and we're doing a walking tour where folks can go around and sort of scan those images and learn more from a Native lens. So for us, we don't call it decolonization, we call it indigenize. We are taking and we are redoing that Indigenous lens here in San Francisco, you know, by American Indian people for American Indian people to re-educate the public. So we don't necessarily use that term either, but I definitely understand how it has been, you know, why it's important that we do decolonize to some extent our thought process and our mind process. So I'll pass it on over to Brandie.
Thank you. So it is a part of my title, but it doesn't mean that I'm like in love with it. And I think it's really important for us as a field to be critical, or to, even as Indigenous folks, and for us to continue to be critical about movements and the co-opting of movements, because I think decolonization is definitely in this space where it's co-opt, right? Like it's consistently being owned by the colonizers in order to legitimize the colonial work. And so I think that that's really important, is to recognize that, and also to still continue doing work, though, I think is really important. And so at least where I sit in terms of the word, I'm not all about the word decolonization, because I think it implies that it is something that stops at the end of your grant deliverable, and that it is something that is just going to end at the end of your fiscal year. And that's not what this work is. I see it as a verb. It is an action. It's a process. It's a process that we all need to consistently and collectively engage in. It's a transformative process that has so much power if we're all leaning in, doing it in the work, that we can change the field. And so I see it decolonizing, which is why I really, my predecessor and our organization really set in this space, because when they applied for the grant to fund this position, they put Director of Decolonization, and everyone was like, let's stop this. Let's like really do some reflection. And that's why it's decolonizing initiatives, because it's a process. The museum, I agree, museums are birthed from the colonial endeavor, right? Like it's the epitome. The museum that I work at is a monument to the colonizers, both internally and in the collecting practices. And then you look at the exoskeleton, and it has colonizers etched into its skin. But I do really believe in the work. I think the actions that we're taking is consistently creating a global movement that is working towards a better present and a better future. It's looking at repatriation, it's looking at accountability, and all of that is anti-colonial and decolonial action. And I don't think that takes away from indigenizing, because I think indigenizing is a part of that. Land back is a part of that. All of these practices where, again, I really think there's so much power when we're collectively making the field change, because I grew up hating museums. I still am consistently hurt by museums and cry about museums. And I don't want the next generation to have to do that or have to experience that. And so I think that that's where I sit with, I think even just what I feel like I've heard from Joe and also Sharaya, excuse me, is that we're really working to make it better today and for next generations.
Thanks so much to you all. And, Brandie, you raise a good point, because your institution, which has also undergone a name change, and it seems like some internal self-reflection, created this new position through a grant, for example. And then I also wanted to touch on that, Sharaya, you don't work for museums. So this work really needs to extend beyond just what we think of as kind of the typical collecting institution. So really, from all three speakers, I'd just love to hear, what should institutions, whether they're museums, whether they're cultural centers, cultural districts, arts organizations, education organizations, what should we start thinking about doing internally as some of the first steps to start doing this work, regardless of your type of institution? Anyone who wants to start.
Well, I guess I will. I guess from a museum, the advice that I give museums when they ask about this stuff, and indigenizing, decolonization, reclamation, they go, well, how do we move forward? And my standard response is, do your job. The vast, like if you look at museums' mission statement, oftentimes museums, like an art museum, it says we're here to present all the cultures, the artworks of all the artistic traditions of all the cultures of the world. Or natural history museums, we're here to record and present the world's cultures. Well, clearly somewhere in the history of museums, as they're presenting them, there's been a break in that chain. And that break in that chain is they decided for certain cultures, somebody somewhere, that they're not going to present them in a respectful way, or they're not going to get input from the cultures that they're being presented. So my thing for museums is, well, just do what you're supposed to do. What you're supposed to do is present cultures equally in your presentation, in your exhibitions, and who you engage with, and ensure that when you make those relationships, that you keep them and you foster them. Because to me, really, at the end of the day, that's what I foresee museums should be doing, is doing what they're supposed to do. Give equal time and equal space to the cultures that they said that they're going to present. To me, it really that's really at its fundamental, that's what it breaks down. That's what it breaks down to. The end.
Sharaya, do you want me to go first this time, or do you want to?
Yes, let's have you go first.
Okay. So I think I agree with Joe. And I think accountability and truth telling is so important, y'all. We can't talk about thrivance if you're not talking about the cultural genocide and the replication of colonial harm that happened in the past, but it's happening right now too, both intentionally and unintentionally. And so I think that that's really important. And so I think it's doing some reflection and looking internally and looking at the collecting process, looking at the ways that you have been an eraser to Indigenous people, looking at the ways you've never listened to us and prevented access to our cultural resources and our ancestors. And I think that that's really important. When I think about the work that the Museum of Us did, is it was internally looking at where that colonial rock came from, and it was all over, but it also it stemmed from the collections, right? The cultural resources and the language that was used, and the ways that access was privileging researchers or privileging other folks, but not Indigenous peoples. And so I think that that's really important. And saying that, telling the truth about that is so important, because we need to talk about it. And how did these items get to the museum, right? That's a colonial pathway. How do they come in and how are they going out? That's also a colonial pathway too, is that ownership. So I think those are really important. That's what museums can do. And it's also acknowledging, it's not just making that statement, because there's statements all over the place happening, right? And we say, we're sorry, but then what? Those are just words. And so matching that with the action. And I think that that's really important, is changing your practices and policies and listening to Indigenous peoples, listening to Black peoples, listening to peoples of color, because we've been telling y'all that you've been hurting us and that there's colonization and the museums haven't heard. And so what are the communities asking you to shift and to change, and then adapting accordingly. It's that, at least that's where I kind of sit with it when I think about our institution and where I sit.
Both amazing points. I think for me, the three things that I pitch, museum or not, whatever your institution is doing it with us and not on behalf of us. Making sure that whatever content you have is not in the past tense. I was really upset one time, and I keep using this example, you know, Berkeley is one of the institutions in the Bay that was one of the ones that had the first Native American Studies program, and they did a regalia project, and they were talking about regalia like Native women used to do this. They used to gather. I'm like, no, we're not dead. We're here. You know, I see that constantly within my work in all these organizations. So doing it with us, not for us, talking about us in the past tense, and making sure that whatever you do, that you are, you know, being mindful when you're providing a historical context on something, that you're providing a Indigenous context. For example, I just saw we had folks in the California Academy of Sciences. Now's the fun time to call people out. You know, when you're talking about traditional plants on your roof, why don't you talk about who those plants were traditional to? Why don't you talk to Native folks and ask them, you know, about their traditional plant medicines and what their uses for? You know, why don't you talk to the local people around you? You know, I saw the Exploratorium. I know they're working with the Roma-Tusholoni relatives on a project. You know, make sure when you're working on those projects, don't put them inside where only people can pay for them. You know, can do that. If you're going to put big, giant, fancy stuff on the outside of the Exploratorium, why don't you also think about, you know, if that is one of your goals is to educate and do meaningful partnership, put it on the outside where people can see it. Give Native art the same weight that you would other art, regardless if there's a fiscal backing behind it. And, you know, make it part of your job. And you know, don't necessarily, when it's like, hey, you know, don't charge Native folks, don't do whatever, you know, if you're really going to do it in a meaningful way and you're really going to incorporate that art, you come up with the funding for it, you come up with your resources and your time to facilitate that meaningful engagement, and really just be flexible to the folks that you're working with. Because I think for us, one thing that I've realized is all of these people here and all of the work they're doing, the fact that there are American Indian people in these spaces is, you know, I'm sure Brandie and Joe both deal with making up for decades and decades of quote unquote decolonization that needs to take place. So just be really mindful with us and realize that it's amazing we have those folks here. So while everyone's going through this racial equity push that's happening, just make sure that you work with people meaningfully and at their pace and engage them, not just once or twice to check a box, but meaningfully sit down and think about how your institution can include people. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sharaya. Joe or Brandie, do you want to add anything else onto that?
I just have one small thing, is because I would like make it a priority. This work should be a priority, right? Because we see all sorts of other stuff happening. And I think time is a colonial tool, right? They're like, oh, just this process takes long. Yeah, this process is a process. It takes a long time, but everything else takes a long time too, right? And my friend Deborah Yepa-Papan, like she says, like, but what happens when money is pushed into another space because that's your priority? But this isn't necessarily their priority. You're using time as a colonial tool to not do it. And so I think like Deborah hit it right on the head, right? This needs to be a priority. And we see that change can happen. And what happens when you make it a priority? You put money behind it, right? And you put effort and time, and you don't lay people off. Like it's just, so I think that that's also an important aspect when we're talking about these pieces.
Thanks so much, Brandie. And you raised a good point too about processes, because especially now, you know, look at this program we're all joining via Zoom, when a year ago we would have hosted it in person, or shortly before a year ago. So that's actually something I'd love to hear from all three of you as well, is what does your work look like now? What does this work look like, especially in a virtual sphere? And if you can just share anything about sort of how the past year has been for you, it would be great to hear a little bit about this work now and going forward.
Am I going first again?
Well, I didn't know if you had something to say, because you unmuted and then you muted back. And so I didn't know if you had something to say about the previous question. So.
No, I'm good with the previous one is fine. So for me, this past year has certainly been different in the sense that I started, I left my position in Minnesota as the Director of Native American Initiatives in 2019, I think. Took a couple months off, got a research position at a museum in Leiden, Netherlands. And then I got this job. I started here the first week of March. I moved to LA, started work the first week of March, literally worked 4 days in the office and the whole city shut down. So I've been working in my job for a year with only actually going in the museum 4 times, which is kind of strange. Having said that, a lot of our work is we are still meeting a lot with different Native folks and communities via Zoom. One of the things that we're doing at the Autry is we have a brand new research center to hold our collection. It's going to be a very Native friendly space for consultation, to visit works. We have a great collection there of Native items, over 230,000 works, not including archaeology. We have great Native archives and libraries. So right now our big push is to get that open, and that's supposed to open next year. So we've been working a lot that way. We recently signed a MOU with the Tongva, which is sort of spawned out of our need for a land acknowledgement. You know, oftentimes, as Brandie mentioned, I believe Brandie mentioned this, is oftentimes people put land acknowledgement with sort of nothing behind it. With us, we actually created a MOU, a memorandum of understanding, with the Tongva that has a number of steps in there of part of our responsibilities to them. So it's been an interesting year.
Brandie, I'm calling on you to go second.
Thanks for the assist, because I was gonna wait for you to unmute. I think I've been really, like, I think that in terms of busyness, like, and like, how do I feel about it? I'm tired. Like, it's been a really busy time. And to be real about it, like, I've been busier in the midst of a pandemic than I was outside of a pandemic. And I'm in a PhD program, like, so, I mean, in addition to working full time. And so just to be really transparent about that, it's a lot. And dealing with the pain and the struggle that in the effects of this pandemic on our relatives throughout Indian country is real, right? And I can only imagine what it is with our relatives globally, right? Because I think that I'm not even necessarily fully hearing that, and maybe y'all are, but in the context of what's happening at Museum of Us. So we took this opportunity to lean into some other digital opportunities that we had been saying no to for a really long time because we weren't quite sure if Google Arts and Culture was right for us, because they're very object-centered. At least what we saw, they were very object-centered, and it was like, look at our fancy stuff. Let's zoom in and talk about our fancy stuff from kind of a colonial space. And for a really long time, we were like, no, it doesn't really fit with us, right? Because of our commitment to the community. And so we met with Google and kind of had a real conversation saying that I'm not sure that this partnership is right. This is what we want to do. And they were like, okay, yeah, that's fine. And we came to a negotiation space, which made me really happy, because we were standing firm that we weren't going to lean into this opportunity if that was what they want, because that's not who and what we've committed to be with the community, Indigenous community. So we did a Google Arts and Culture exhibit called Colonial Legacy, the Museum Facade. A lot of themes were thrown out there at first, and there was like anti-racism and secrets because of some of the exhibits, and we're going to do ancient Egypt because teachers want that. But really taking this pause and sitting in space in a pause, not to go on vacation, right, or to go drink boba, but to really pause and reflect on what is a decolonial practice, what is the community asking us, and the community has been asking us for decades to talk about those nine colonizers on our facade. And we should be talking about them, and we haven't been. And the ways that we've celebrated this dominant Euro-American like history of these 9 colonizers as the missions and the saviors. So that's where we created, we leaned into that, took the data and heard the requests and wants and needs, and created this Google Arts and Culture page exhibit during the pandemic. And I think there's the link, Ali, if y'all want to see it, please, you're welcome to see it. It's the first step, hopefully, in a long series of colonial legacy, because we got a lot of truth telling to do, both internally from our organization, but in museums as a whole, right? Thinking about colonial pathways of cultural resources too, and in connection with communities. So I think this was one of the spaces that we really started to work with during the pandemic. And then we've also have been working about reframing our exhibits. And so we've been working in collaboration with some Maya community consultants about changing the practices and changing the content. And so we've been putting decolonizing initiatives and action signs throughout the museum that is very public, saying that we recognize this as a colonial exhibit, that it says these and paints these folks as people of the past. We're working on it so that folks will, once we ever open, folks will know that there's work going on behind the scenes, and not just seeing that it's kind of this ego of museum authority and they're coming in thinking that that's the way it is. But we're recognizing and truth telling that we see that that's not the way that it is, and that it is our fault for it. And then we have a space underneath it that says this is our commitment and this is how we're engaging in consultations, and that Indigenous peoples are the authority. So those, I think, are the two tangible examples that I can provide.
I love that. I love that you brought that up, Brandie, because I think that that's going to be so many people's question is in the interim, like, when we can't implement these things, or, you know, Indigenous folks are saying speed up but slow down at the same time, what can we do? How can we hold ourselves accountable? Because I know that we've been doing that with planning and other folks, and we've actually had to go hire our own data person, you know, from the governor's office to come and like do research for us, because like you said, there's so much truth telling, and I can relate to that 100%. I think I've been in more back Zoom meetings, you know, now that we're not running from building to building. And you know, I feel like this is, you know, since we're saying we're not the museum, we're the story, right? We're the living story of our culture and our people. And that's how the cultural district is doing it a little bit differently, is we're going around and documenting those sites and talking to our elders. And the hardest part for me is normally in this situation, we'd be sitting in a room in a panel and we'd have those community members there and look them in the eye and talk to them and go out and talk to the community. And we're having to, as the cultural district, do all this like first time engagement for so many different things. And it's happening on Zoom, and we're really losing those vital perspectives of our elders, of our people that don't have access to, you know, this digital media and these spaces, like even these amazing things Brandie's doing. You know, when I want to share them with my elders who don't have computers, who don't know how to use those things. I think Indian Ed just did a survey with pioneers, and it was 80% of our folks either don't have access to the internet or have some sort of access to a shared device. So, I mean, that, and those were just the families surveyed within Indian Ed in San Francisco. So, I mean, that's huge. So I think about, yes, we're moving, we're shaking, we're doing all these things, but all these things also require good engagement and good community input and community voice, which is really hard to do when we're moving so fast. We're making up for decades of stuff, and then everything is happening right here on this internet sphere. So I just wanted to circle it back with, you know, with what Brandie was sharing, was just like, put those accountability measures in place and talk about what is wrong and what you plan to do to fix it and to work on it from a good place. But yeah, I'm exhausted. I'm tired. We are the community in San Francisco that doesn't have a historical context statement. We don't have any of the, you know, sites documented from our non-federally recognized Ramaytush Ohlone relatives that are documented in historical ways. So we're all working on doing that and documenting the sites that are important to our community, like old Indian businesses and stuff like that. You know, so we don't have a community needs assessment in the city. We don't have, you know, good data that hasn't existed for a really long time. So we're constantly running with everybody's racial equity initiatives to try and keep up. And I can only imagine in the museum space what that looks like as well.
Thanks so much, Sharaya. And Brandie or Joe, if you want to add anything else on what that looks like in museums. Otherwise, I did want to circle back to something that Joe mentioned from one of our earlier discussions when we were talking about this program, and that was land acknowledgement. So it would be great to hear from all of you if you have any recommendations for institutions who want to learn more about doing land acknowledgement and also doing it properly, not just doing it to give lip service. So any advice for the folks in our audience today? That would be great.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think my advice, of course, is to work with the Native community from where you live, but not just come up with a statement, but also put some real teeth behind it, develop a relationship. As I mentioned, for us, we created a memorandum of understanding. So we have responsibility to the community, not only with the land that we sit on. We have 3 sites in the LA area, but also ensuring that there is input and collaboration with education, with exhibitions, with how to care for the collection. So it's more than just sort of a one-shot deal. It's an opportunity to really create positive relationships with Native communities in your area, because as you had mentioned, is if you just put it up there and call it good, it really doesn't have much impact. And I'm going to call on Brandie to go next.
really felt like Sharaya had something to say. I saw your head moving and I was like, oh, she's gonna drop the mic on us. I just know it. Y'all, there are so many resources out there. There are like pamphlets, there are webinars, there are resources that can help you do this. And I think I agree with the action. I agree. I think stop like the fear. And I mean, some people are like, we're not afraid. You're anxious. That's rooted in fear, right? Why are we so afraid? Like, stop it. Like, I feel now where I'm like, if you don't have a land acknowledgement, why? What's wrong, right? And side note, I also recognize that like our Museum of Us has been, the museum that I work at, has been really diving into this work, to the decolonizing initiatives work for about 10 years and really leaning in deep, like within the last 3 or 4 years. And it's taken us until about this year to like the last 2 years to get a land acknowledgement on our website, to get one in the exhibits. And so I just say that in the context that I'm like, we're doing work, but it also takes, because of that fear, that concern, right? The board, like, what does that really mean? There are websites out there that talk about what that really means. Like we have it on our website, ask questions, there's all sorts. So I think that if you can't Google, like, then I think that that's a challenge, because I think it's all over the place. And I don't feel like I could offer anything that Indigenous people haven't already said.
Thank you both. I'm just shaking my head because that's a good percentage of the work we do here in San Francisco. So the American Indian Cultural District actually partnered with one of our board members and our Ramaytush Ohlone relatives, Greg Castro and Jonathan Cordero, to actually implement a Human Rights Commission resolution for a land acknowledgement. And as a result of that, we've been working with, I think currently I'm working with the Library Commission, the Department of Public Health Commission, and the environment, the Commission on the Environment, which I just posted that in there. And so kind of going off of what Joe said is, when we sit down and we do these, and typically we do these in partnership with our Ramaytush, because, you know, they're grateful to them, is that, you know, while this is about acknowledging Ramaytush, creating teeth in these different areas to also recognize the harms and historical, you know, ways to work with the American Indian community. So I posted an example from the Commission on the Environment that we did. And when we sat down with them, we're like, hey, we don't just want an acknowledgement that says we see Ramaytush people. We want an acknowledgement that says we're going to include traditional ecological knowledge moving forward. We want an acknowledgement that says we want to engage in meaningful consultation. We're currently doing that with the Library Commission, where we're taking an acknowledgement where they're going to go ahead and they've started working on a resource section for research for us, so that when kids go in and they're doing their 4th grade mission project, they know where to go, so that policymakers and decision makers in the city can actually consult with the library and have a database that they can go in and find history about American Indians. And they're working with the cultural district to start documenting everything that we do. Like if we're involved in it, they're creating archives for it. So whenever we're doing these land acknowledgements, we're doing them with teeth in them, so that it's not just, hey, we see you, but hey, we see you, and you know, this is what our commitment in writing on what we're going to do to move forward with you. In terms of us, I know one of the recommendations was to work with your local Native folks. Yes, send it, you know, to our Ramaytush relatives. Feel free to CC us, but also, like, I think we've done at least 20, and by me, I'd not mean all, just mean mostly Ramaytush relatives have done at least 20 different land acknowledgements, resolutions, and what have you, the ballet, theater companies, whatever you can think of in the last few months because of this big racial equity push. So like Brandie said, and I provided a resource, go Google it, look at what's existing. But the one thing that I tell people when I go sit in these meetings is they ask, well, you know, what do we put in here? And it's like, I want to know why you as an organization specifically, because I can't tell you this. Why is it important for you to be doing this land acknowledgement, right? If you're a museum, if you're a science academy, why is it important in your sciences, including traditional ecological knowledge? Why is it important for you to be engaging? Because there's enough of us coming and telling you constantly, hey, it's important for you to include us. I want to know from you and from your perspective and what your mission and what your values and what your goal is of why it's important to be including Native people. So before you even start the process of a land acknowledgement, sit back and reflect with yourself and your people and your company and your organizations. Don't just check a box because this is racial equity and we're in the middle of BLM and acknowledging people's land. No. Sit back and really think about if you want to do it from a meaningful perspective, and then approach Native folks and say, hey, this is why we want to do it. And so now we're coming with you. How do we do it the right way? And so that would just be my recommendation. And I know that's a lot. So think about why you want to do it. Look at the resources that are already out there and think about when you do it, how you can create a meaningful relationship from the services and the resources that you offer. Thank you. I see you smiling over there, Brandie. What are you going to say?
I was just gonna be like, see, I'll drop in the mic.
It's about 20% of maybe 30% of what we do now. So.
Thanks so much, Sharaya. That was really great and really great to hear all of your perspective. So before we turn it over to our audience for Q&A, I'll just ask one more question of both the negatives and the positives. So in your work, what are some of the biggest challenges you've faced around doing the decolonization, reclamation, indigenization work? But then also, what are some of the biggest successes you've seen, maybe working with institutions or within your own institutions, especially more recently?
I'm going to call on Sharaya.
Oh, the biggest challenges we faced. For me, it's re-education. We're constantly having to engage and re-educate people. And I don't mean to call out any particular department or anything, but like working with planning, working with historic preservation, 50 years historic preservation has been around in San Francisco. They have not acknowledged or done anything. They've done it on several other communities, but not the American Indian community. I'm like, come on, y'all, this is ridiculous. And then I'm working on a grant with planning and they're completely writing in, you know, Native people used to live, it's just talking about us in the past tense again, identifying the community as Indigenous, not understanding the differences between Indigenous and American Indian. So it's exhausting. It's exhausting to constantly have to go into these spaces over and over again and consistently re-educate people on who we are, on what it means. And so we're building a cultural competency plan. We're actually working with Morningstar Gali, who's a known activist for restoring justice for Indigenous peoples and the International Indian Treaty Council. So super excited, but for me, that's the biggest challenge. The wins are that we're even working on a grant with those individuals to have the first ever historical context statement, the first time that the city's actually acknowledging that we're on Ramaytush Ohlone land, the Board of Supervisors, the Human Rights Commission. I mean, all of these first, the first time the cultural district's expanding and people actually understanding, oh my God, there's still natives in this city. All the visibility that's resulting from the work that's happening is amazing. And I'm so like happy to be working with such amazing leaders to like be building these pathways. But at the same time, the re-education and the just lack of understanding from everybody whose land you're on and the history and what's really happening gets exhausting to continuously keep re-educating people in almost every single engagement we have every day. So thank you.
Brandie?
So I agree with Sharaya, absolutely. I think it's exhausting. I think for me, museums are hostile, right? They're hostile environments. Academia, hostile environment. Going to the grocery store, hostile environment, right? So I just think that, because what is it like the images, like the marketing, the material, right? So I think it's really difficult in terms of entering in this space and working to create space that is better for the present and the future, but consistently like navigating the hostility and the coloniality and asking museums to bear their coloniality and white fragility and like how that comes into play, and professional fragility, because people built their entire lives because they love museums. And okay, but there's also the reality that museums have done terrible, terrible things and continue to do terrible things. And so those realities live in the same space. And so I think that there's that. I think going into cultural resources, our cultural resources are angry and hurt and they're in a lot of pain. And I think that is hard to come in and feel that and be a part of it and trying to work. What does that mean working with communities? Because communities are mad, and rightfully so, right? And processing through that. This Google Arts and Culture exhibit, hard, important. And I'm so happy that it's there, but like doing the research is reliving the atrocities that these colonizers did to our ancestors. And granted, I'm not a California Indian, but I'm Indigenous, right? And they are relatives. And I'm just knowing that and knowing that's also ripples, right? Because it's all connected. And so I think part of our work at Museum of Us is to get the board and all staff and everything, and being accountable. And so it's reliving that colonial history all the time to make sure everyone's on the same page, because we're bringing in, our CEO calls it the hug. When we're bringing more people into the hug, you've got to show them what the hug entails, right? Like, what is that? And so the history of the hug. And so I think that is constantly painful. And the labor and emotional and physical labor falls on the Black Indigenous communities of color, right? And so I think that that's difficult. I think the amazing part, like why I'm still here, is I think about radical love, and I think radical love has a place because it's because I love my people, right? And why else would we show up each day if we didn't love our people and love the future of our people? And then I think about I see change happening. This exhibit, right? The GAC, I call it GAC, the GAC exhibit, right? The changes in processes, these policies, repatriation, communities connecting to their ancestors and cultural resources that they've been blockaded from seeing for like decades. And so I think I think about those moments are just really powerful, and also talking to students, because I think they're just the next generation. I'm like, yeah, y'all can change it, like, sucker punch the industry.
Maybe it is my age or my experience. I don't know what it could. I don't know what it is. I just listen to my friends here talk. For me, there really hasn't been any drawbacks, and the reason why I say that, it's because during my museum career, I worked at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, National Museum of the American Indian, Minnesota Historical Society, and now at the Autry. I can honestly say the discussions I've had with people there, whether museum staff or senior management or the public, is once you tell them the importance of Native people facilitate Native people connecting with the works their ancestors created, whether it's Native people having access to these works, to the intellectual property, to tell their story. I honestly think the vast majority of people, their instinct understands it's the right thing to do. And with that, based on my experience, with that, they'll often, once you assist them getting their head around it, with that, they're often more than happy to work along with you. Part of it is trying to get everybody on the same page. And I think particularly with the events of 2020, institutions can sort of see this rising, and I know they can't avoid it. I was talking with a friend of mine, this has been a couple of years back, when that movie Black Panther came out. Remember that? And remember the character was in the, sorry, I forgot the names. He was in the gallery and he asked where this African work came from. And my friend of mine, who's a little goofy, but doesn't really matter. My friend of mine, as we're talking about that and how museums are starting to change, he described it, this is before 2020, he described it as a post-Black Panther museum world. Because through that one scene, young people, when they go to museums, they go, hey, yeah, how did they get that African object? Hey, yeah, how did they get that Native American object? And for people my age, we sort of understand the history, that young people maybe who weren't necessarily interested in museums, who weren't necessarily interested as much in this cultural heritage, I think that was part of a process of them really being able to latch on. And I think through that latching on, particularly with my friends here, there's a renewed enthusiasm, which I think is great. Of course, my advice is, let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's look back to see what has been done for the past nearly 50 years and continue forward as opposed to reinventing the wheel. But overall, I think for me, I really haven't had any bad experiences. All of it has been pretty much overall positive. Yeah, sometimes you have to do a little bit of wrestling and do sort of a little dance. But I think overall, like I said, I think deep down people in their heart understand that is the right thing to do.
Just want to say for us, we had to reinvent the wheel because the wheel never existed. The historical context statement never existed. The data use in the city never existed. So we did have to step into a little bit of a different space where we're like, sorry, but I wish we had that sort of privilege on a larger scale. But so that's where we're like, hey, this is kind of going crazy right now.
Well, thanks so much all. We just have a little over 5 minutes left. So if any of our panelists want to wrap up with any other thoughts or comments, otherwise, if anyone in the audience has any questions, feel free to use the raise hand button or pop a question into the chat, and we'll have a few more minutes for questions from our fantastic panelists. Anyone from our audience? So here's one that just came into the chat. Any thoughts on museums paying land tax?
No, I have no thoughts on that.
An interesting question. Well, while we're waiting to see if anyone else has any other questions, Brandie, I actually have one for you because I was fortunate to see you speak at CAM in 2019, which I also think was about 5 days before the shelter in place hit, and see your presentation. And I'd love to hear just a little bit more about some of the Museum of Us's more recent initiatives. It looks like there was some just rethinking about terminology, some things that some other staff are doing in addition to your great work. So anything else you want to share about how the museum got to that point, or anything that other institutions could take away?
I'm a little sorry. I'm a little confused. The question was, I hear you, so Cam, but could you rephrase the question just a little bit, because I'm not quite sure what you're asking.
Sure. So just a little bit more about the San Diego Museum of Us's work in, not only your position, but I know there's been some discussions on changing terminology in terms of talking about exhibits and collections, and just anything else you want to share about some of the more recent work your institution has been doing that other museums might be able to take away.
Thanks, Paige. Sorry about that. I also just saw Deborah. I'm so excited to hear that. Thank you. And I'm quite pleased that we are continuing to the work and making it a priority, I want to now read your MA thesis. So if you want to email it to me, that would be wonderful. I think the work is continuing. We went from a staff of 66 to now 15. And so physicians absorbed quite a bit. Our capacity is not necessarily what it was, and yet we're still moving forward with this work, right? So we are working on reframing the Maya exhibit, working with a gathering of consultants who are descendants of the Maya community, recognizing that they can't represent all community members. And so we'll be transparent about that. And they are working collectively to see kind of where and how they want the reframing of the exhibit to be. So that's been happening within this last year. It's going to continue to be happening, and hopefully by December we'll have a new iteration of the exhibit. I'm working on signs, and so I think when we think about it, many times sorry, I'm going to go on a little bit tangent if that's okay, but thinking about it, like many times you see exhibits going decolonizing practices, right? Or you see an education program going decolonizing practices. And those are great. And I love that. And I think that they're important and they have their place. And I think there's a space where it's a symbiotic relationship. Like you need policy and you need practice. And then it shifts the ethos, it shifts the environment. And I can write policy all day and it can live on the shared drive and be fancy words that either I wrote or my predecessor, Jacqueline Russell, who's also amazing, wrote, right? But if the practice doesn't match that, then it's just going to just continue, right, and be colonial. But you can have like education programs and these public programs and these exhibits But if the policy doesn't do it, it's not sustainable, because if I leave and I'm an educator to go have a chicken farm, there's nothing to hold the next person accountable. And so I think that they have to happen together. And so that's where we're really seeing it. And then also looking and like stepping back and being reflexive, and like, what does it look like to see like how the patterns replicate in our marketing, which I think, Paige, maybe you saw, like, you know, what boats are you using, in our language, in our board structure, in the way that we talk about raising money. Like, HR is a colonial entity. And so how is like colonization deeply embedded systemically within your organization? I think that's really important, is to do that deep dive and think about, what does bereavement look like? And why is it only for like this concept of what family is? It doesn't match many cultural communities, right? And what does it look like? Why to be able to take leave, and who gets to take leave? So I think that that's kind of where we're really leaning into, is looking at it at all layers, and looking at our HR practices, looking and making sure that our policies and our practices match. I hope that's what you were looking for, Paige.
Yes, that's wonderful. Thank you. So I know we're just about out of time, but I did want to address one more question that was put in the chat. Do you have any recommendations on opportunities museums and arts institutions can or should offer to Indigenous youth?
I can talk about some of my experience, if you don't mind.
Please.
So when I was at the Minnesota Historical Society, I started a project there that was based on Native American lacrosse. And for those of you that, you know, lacrosse is really a native game. And there's this particular style of Great Lakes lacrosse where the sticks are hand carved. It's basically a stick with a small hoop on top. And they were played by mostly Native young people. And I started this program there where the museum paid for, oh gosh, maybe 50 handmade lacrosse sticks to be made, and I'd host games in the city for Native youth to come along. They would play, and then I'd give away sticks on behalf of the institution. And part of this process was the museum itself also had lacrosse sticks, but also lacrosse has really many aspects to traditional Native American culture. It's respect, it's nutrition, taking care of your body, spirituality, all these things together. So part of this program, working with other people, particularly my good friend, John Hunter in the Twin Cities, was an opportunity to work with the Native youth using Native lacrosse sort of as a road where we not only talked about items within the collection and how they have a life within their own and tell stories, but also how we can use some of these ideas and Native lacrosse to help empower youth. So we didn't take a direct route, I guess you could say, but instead we used our collection, created this program and worked with the youth. At the Autry, I'm in the very early stages, like very early, of working on a Native skateboarding culture in California. And theoretically, I'm going to use the same methodology that I used in Minnesota to engage with Native youth.
Thanks so much, Joe. Those are excellent examples, and I look forward to seeing the Native skateboard art exhibit. Hopefully there'll be an online component as well, so it has a broader reach. We're out of time now, so I realize we may not have gotten to every question in the chat, but I want to thank our audience for participating, for sharing this conversation. A huge thank you to Brandie, Sharaya, and Joe for leading this discussion and sharing your knowledge, your insights, your expertise, especially with this topic that is really important for the museum community, the arts community at large to be discussing. So as I mentioned in the chat, this recording will be made available soon. Give us a little bit of time. We'll edit out the beginning part before the program started and get it up on YouTube. So we'll probably have that in a week or so. Please check back with Cultural Connections, look at our website and social media. Our May program, as Carly mentioned, will be on community-centric fundraising. So thanks again, a huge round of applause to our speakers, and we look forward to staying in touch with all of you.